Good evening. I think evening sessions are going to be really tiring. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with a story, an interesting story. It is about one of the most infamous conmen of India. His cons were so audacious that his name became synonymous with con and fraud, right? So who is this guy? This guy's name is Natwar Lal. So Natwar Lal actually sold Taj Mahal. He didn't sell it once, but he sold it a couple of times. He sold Red Fort, and I don't know what kind of mind-bending Jedi tricks he had. He actually could convince buyers that he was in authority to sell Taj Mahal, one of the 7 wonders of the world, right? So it's very interesting. I mean, his fraud ended up in a prison sentence of over 100 years, you know? And he used to say that no prison in the world can actually hold him, and he actually did break out a number of times. Movies have been made about his con, and it's just interesting the kind of audacious things he tried to do. He cheated everyone in his death. People thought that he was dead in 1990. He showed a death certificate. All his cases were dropped, and lo and behold, actually his family cremated him in 2009. So these are stories of his fraud are legendary, right? Now, if I had to kind of demystify it, look at the story I told and look at the nouns in the story. Each noun here is an identity. It needs authentication, it needs verifiable credentials, right? So if Natwar Lal, and by the way, that was not his name, if Natwar Lal was an authenticated identity, and what was his verified credential? Was he a broker? Was he allowed to sell? Similarly, Taj Mahal also needs an identity. Things also need identity. It has to be one of the 7 wonders of the world and not a replica in a gift shop, right? So that needs identity. And so does buyer, right? Buyer also needs an identity. So that tells you about the identity aspect of it. But important aspect is that he was able to perpetrate this con because of the centralization of the system, right? He was able to look at points of failure and exploit them, right? So this is a great segue into my topic, which is decentralized identity. Now, Web3, we have heard a lot about it. Web3 is all about spatial web, semantic web. It is about creator economy. But Web3 still remains an iteration over Web 2, right? So Web3 experience has to be similar or better than Web 2, right? So if that is the case, then all the foundational elements of Web3 also need to perform at the level that Web 2 performs or better, right? So you're talking of Amazon, the transactions per second during Christmas, or MasterCard and Visa, they peak at about 35,000 transactions per second, right? So can your blockchain do that? Because blockchain is the decentralized framework on which Web3 would be built. So I'm going to talk about these 4 foundational aspects of Web3. There are a few more in the stack, but I'm going to talk about what it should have, right? So decentralized identity, we know factors of authentication. First factor of authentication is what you know, passwords, right? Web 1.0 was all about first factor of authentication. Second factor of authentication is actually what you have, which is the OTP, one-time password. Most of the Web 2 has, first or second factor, right? The third factor of authentication is who you are. That's the biometric identity. I think if we look at Web3 and what it wants to deliver, a thriving ecosystem should be targeting a 3FA. The governance becomes a pain, by the way. I'll talk about it in the next slide. So the governance has to be simple of decentralized identity, which is very easy when you're in a centralized system, but the moment you talk about decentralization, it becomes a problem. The third thing is data minimization. I mean, it is a given, but if you are replicating data, today, each and every website will have a separate identity of yours. So that is data replication, but you need to aim for data minimization. You have to create such conditions that data is minimized when you implement decentralized identity. In terms of blockchain, if you had to do equivalent or better than Web 2.0, then you need to have scale. Definitely, you need to have scales. Today, there are blockchains which scale, but frankly speaking, the scale that we are talking of in Web 2.0 is mind-boggling, right? Are we there yet? You need to have security. So 51% attack is not tenable. So if I was going to build an app on top of a blockchain infrastructure for Web3, if there is a 51% attack, there is a problem. I'm not saying all consensus mechanisms are prone to that, but there are. And lastly, it has to be sustainable. I mean, the energy consumption of blockchain is mind-boggling. How are we saying that we'll build a Web3 thriving ecosystem and guzzling energy, right? It's not given. I mean, it has to be actually better than Web 2.0, if at all, right? The third layer is dApps or smart contracts. And why I mentioned smarter contracts is that you need to create an ecosystem where there is ease of development of smart contracts. You cannot have another new language to learn. It has to be scripted. It can be done by non-technical people. We have to create an ecosystem which has smarter contracts. Smarter contracts need to be scalable, and they need to have event-based triggers, right? There is no centralized, there is no BPO, there is no support. It has to be self-sustaining, so it has to have event-based triggers. Some platforms have, others don't, so that is a given. And finally, tokenized assets. I mean, these three are core layers. Tokenized assets are very important. And when I say tokenized asset, fractional ownership is extremely important if you're talking of creator economy. And frankly speaking, if you had to sell Taj Mahal, I'm sure there's no single buyer who can buy it, right? So your target segment is too low. So you need to fractionalize it, and there has to be a fractional ownership, right? So at Archethic, we are trying to work on some of these foundational aspects which will create a Web3 ecosystem. So biometrics, I wanted to talk about biometrics. If you had to do a three-factor authentication, right, then how do you implement a biometric solution that is not centralized, right? Today, the biometric solutions that we have are called scoring biometrics. So essentially, you're going to store a pattern, and you do a match. And if you have 80% and more, you have a biometric solution that works, right? So you have to move from scoring biometrics to something else which is decentral, right? And that is where I coined the word crypto biometrics. What we are trying to do is that can you create from a biometric information a private public key pair, right? So if you create that, and you don't store that anywhere, every time a person provides that identity, your key is generated, and it unlocks whatever is logged using your private key. That is going to be decentralized, right? And there is no key storage, there is no key management, you don't have to remember that big mnemonic and phrase. So you need to move from scoring biometrics to crypto biometrics if you need to do a 3FA in a decentralized identity. Otherwise, it's not possible. There is scoring biometrics will remain centralized. It will be single point of failure always. Now, the other thing that interesting stuff that we did from a decentralized identity perspective is that, in metaverse, let's say Web3, right? In metaverse, people will have numerous identities, right? There is a single person behind so many identities. Now, do you store each and every such identity? Is each and every such identity self-sovereign? No, I think the better way would be creating an identity chain. And you have your seed or the root, which is created from your biometric information, and that unlocks your various other identities, right? So you can create an interoperable ecosystem whereby identity is stored in one of the infrastructures, and you unlock and get your identity and use it in the other system. So that was a bit on the biometrics part. Now, on the blockchain part, blockchain, I think the first thing that is given is scale. I mean, when we were thinking about this project in 2017, the kind of blockchain solutions available were providing somewhere between 15 to 25 TPS, right? And with a 15 to 25 TPS kind of a solution, how do you build a marketplace, right? It's just impossible. I mean, how do you scale? So scalability is given, right? And as far as possible, can you create a horizontal scale? Can you create a scale which, with every node, the throughput increases? Is linear scalability possible, right? The second thing is you need to figure out more secure consensus mechanisms. So we did some research, and we are working on something based on atomic commitment, whereby even if there is 90% maliciousness in the network will slow down, but it will not subvert the truth, right? So it will not, there is no possibility of fraud at all. And in this new Web3 era, you need some kind of self-healing mechanisms, right? When I say self-healing mechanisms, every year you go through the surge of festivals. You can predict your traffic patterns. You know that in Christmas things will go up. So if you are able to do that, can you do some kind of machine learning, and can you predict these patterns and be ready for such kind of events? So then it's not just scalable. It is also, it's going to take, it's future-proof, kind of. And lastly, it has to have low energy consumption. We cannot work and create a thriving Web3 ecosystem and consume energy equivalent to size of a country, right? So it's just not possible. So those were a couple of elements and my introduction about the foundational elements of Web3 and what we are doing to create that kind of a thriving ecosystem. I'm going to end also with a story. And some of you might have seen this picture, right? And that will be telling your age. I have seen it. So my title of my talk was Netscape Moment, right? It has become a word now, right? Netscape Moment. And Netscape Moment is the moment when any technology crosses the chasm of moving from a geek or a nerd domain and gets mass adopted. And this was the case with internet, right? Web 1.0, it was limited to academics, defense sector in 80s. And in early 1990, Netscape created an ecosystem whereby any user could browse the web. They created, as you can see, a community around it. They created a store around it. And that is when it just took off. In 95, I think, they had 70% market share. Right? So Netscape Moment is something that blockchain is waiting. And I think it's now a decade. So I think it's over a decade. I mean, if I take 2009, right? So now is the time where a platform which is able to scale and is sustainable and which has the right decentralized identity implemented, such a platform will take, it has to be simple to use, and believe me, the simplicity is a given. I can't tell my grandmother to use blockchain because it's crazy, the private key management, right? So it has to be simple. And once you have this kind of a infrastructure, I think the Netscape moment of blockchain will arrive. Thank you.